everybody, I am so excited because today I have invited composer Gregory Wanamaker, almost teacher, but we never actually got there. And you know what? It's kind of a blessing because I'm pretty sure I would have sucked. I wouldn't say that theory was my forte by any stretch of the imagination.
I never even taught theory. I taught musicianship.
Exactly.
They called it theory. It wasn't theory, it was reality.
I'm really excited to have you on. You're the first composer that I've had listening to other composers' music from this wide world of video games, and you know nothing about video games. Is that correct?
My gaming experience involves mostly like puzzle games, things like that.
I'm going to sort of thrust you into the wide world of video game music here pretty intensely. We have about 20-ish tracks. We'll see how far we get before your brain melts. Yeah, let's get started. The first section is going to be called Oldies, which much to my chagrin as an almost 37-year-old at this point.
Oh, you were a spring chicken.
Yeah, I know. The first track is going to be, it's called Vampire Killer. It's from Castlevania. This game came out in 1987. The way that they used to do things, it's really interesting because composers were essentially computer engineers, and there's a whole complex nature of how they didn't sit down at the MIDI keyboard and like pluck it out. But it's interesting how there's still sort of a melodic forward momentum in there. And I was curious what you thought about that.
Well, this brings back, I graduated from high school in 1987.
I was born in 1987.
I thought you looked familiar. It was really before that time, when like games like Frogger and Pac-Man, when they came out, and all of this music is, I'm going to say, similar in the way you described it as to, how it was created. It's all synthetic. I never really thought about, actually, at the time, who would compose that or how that was composed. So if it's really the engineers who compose it, that's really pretty impressive, because not that they might not have a musical background or they didn't think of themselves necessarily as composers. This was part of making the game interesting. The way you said also about, the theme, this melodic line and these consistent textures and the synthesized drum that, those rat-a-tats and whatnot that do push this forward, despite the fact that this music is constantly on a loop. When I think of this, I'm not thinking necessarily of video game music because of the content of the music. It's mostly because of that synthesized sound that was used so much 80s and 90s, or even like, earlier 80s with the Atari console. It's hard for me to really state an opinion about this. I mean, because it is exactly what it's supposed to be,
Yeah.
And that's important. That's part of the whole deal.
I also think it's interesting because there's absolutely nostalgia glasses for a lot of us that grew up in, the early 90s. I feel like we can't listen to where we've gone if we don't listen to where we were.
Absolutely. That's important, I think, pretty much in all art.
Let's move on to a little bit later. Chrono Trigger is one of those definitive games for a lot of folks. We visit different time periods of the same area, if that makes sense. So we go all the way back to the prehistoric time period. We go into the future. So this is Corridors of Time.
Thinking of this as evolutionary, from the last thing, one of the things that's really added is a wonderful textural variety. I love the addition of these layered gestures, like those sustained chords, and that comes underneath. It's imaginative. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily also because of the evolution of the technology in making this. Certainly, this is much more compositionally sophisticated. Plus, it's longer. There is a developing melody. that happens over top with that kind of reedy, that kind of reedy sound. Any harmonic changes that exist happen over that bass line, over that groove.
Right.
And the repetitive, percussion. Was this kind of done in the same way, just 7 years later?
Yasunori Mitsuda was the composer, and I think at this point, at this stage in the 90s, I think we did have MIDI at this point.
We had MIDI as early as 1987. If you know Steve Reich, Different Trains, the string quartet with the sampled sound, that was a result of sampling and the ability for musical instrument digital interface, MIDI, be a part of that composition.
Chrono Trigger is one of these games that, because it really is narratively driven and the music has to aid in that narrative, we start to really see the programmatic soundscape. And so there's so much and this is something I really enjoy doing. And actually, sometimes I prefer not knowing the context of video games, because I feel like it allows my ear to play a little bit more with imagination, rather than being this is exactly what happens and this is where this music comes from, which is very impactful. But there is something really beautiful about you hear this sort of an Indian quality to it, and it makes your brain sort of spin, with the drums, and you wonder what does this song represent? What does this song mean?
I mean, you said there's a narrative element. I mean, you go back and forth between time periods in the same place. How much does the music change? If that happens, then that's also this is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
I mean, the soundscape changes. You do get, when you go to the prehistoric era, you get a heavy drum tribal quality, because you're in the village is now a tribal village. Then you get into the jungle, and that's the soundscape. And then you get into the technological time period, which is actually a pretty depressing time period. So you get a different soundscape even there. A lot of classical music purists, and certainly some folks that I've had on the channel themselves, have been well, it's not the same as seeing it or hearing it live. And I'm well, yeah, but the sheer volume that can be produced in video games, because we're able to compose at the computer and don't necessarily need a full orchestra to create that soundscape, is actually staggering.
I don't really know what a classical music purist is. I think I've met people who call themselves that, and I don't believe them that they really are, because they exist in a world where we are inundated with all kinds of music. I mean, you walk into a grocery store and you get 70s yacht rock and all that, and it's not live because it was made in the studio. There were live musicians, so there's that live element. Now, the relevance to that is that in both the Vampire Killer and Chrono Trigger, someone live made those things. They can be orchestrated. Yes, you can take these things, you can transcribe them, you can orchestrate them, and you can make these for live orchestra. But the thing is, that's not original. That's what that is completely changing the whole context and changing the whole sound of everything. When in fact the document, the historical document, it exists in this synthetic context, and it is exactly, like I said before, it's exactly what it's supposed to be. This is exactly what it is. Why orchestrate this, and why listen to these people who call themselves classical purists? Because that's not what this is for. You and I are going to talk about context of other pieces, and then we're going to say, well, I wish we weren't talking about context because we're talking about the music. But the thing is, the music does exist with the context, but it also can exist on its own. I mean, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, that exists on its own. It became a concert piece, when it was composed for ballet. So you go back to Tchaikovsky, the soundtrack to Chrono Trigger exists on its own. It does exist on its own, and it can exist on its own, whether you want to hear it that way or not as something else, whether you want it arranged for orchestra or whether you want it arranged for 9 snare drums and an oboe.
There is an orchestral arrangement of this, actually. It's stunning.
It is stunning.
Yeah, but the original is as good. It's just it's a question of what you want to sort of chew on. Vampire Survivors has a very 80s 90s feel to it. This is a sort of a reinterpretation, if you will, a variation on a style. This is essentially a rearrangement of something, but also in another game. So it's like mixed and matched, which is really cool.
This reminds me of prog rock, borderline prog metal bands. There's a Canadian group called Saga. They had a couple of hits in the 80s. One was called On the Loose. Something like that style of guitar. The drums were not necessarily as relentless, but there was a combination of acoustic and electronic drums.
Yeah.
Not to mention the singer, who had a very operatic sound. It was they're a very interesting band. I have no idea if this was influenced by that or anything like that, but this sort of reminds me of that kind of sound. It's very energetic. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's very energetic. You have to be aware. It's because of its repetition, it's not necessarily distracting. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that it has all those kind of textural things.
It's like stacked on top of itself so well.
Yeah, we have yet to talk about dynamics. It may not be as relevant with this particularly because it's not a narrative game the way you described it. I mean,
not Vampire Survivors, not especially.
This in particular, it's one dynamic.
Yeah.
And but dynamic and volume are not necessarily the same thing. Dynamic's not necessarily about loudness. Volume is actually a little bit different than loud and soft, because volume has to do with the density of sound as well. This ceases to produce the same kind of regular tension because it's a loop and it's one dynamic. It's one level of intensity throughout. And I'm going to contradict myself by saying it does build a bit. But the thing is, everything is loud and in your face.
Yeah.
And I want to say, I don't mean any of that as a negative comment. It is just exactly what it is. It would be interesting to see what the composer might do to develop this further so it actually becomes one of these epic prog things.
With a build and
Yeah. The reason why I'm also saying that is that we're talking about the music without the context.
Right.
In context, this may be perfect.
How many times have you listened to a piece or composed a piece, or certainly in opera, so many times you oh, you're
sorry, my face is glowing now. It got dark out and it got worse. I'm sorry. Start your question over, or feel free to include this because everybody's going to know I'm vain.
In reality, the earworm is actually more potent if it loops, especially if there's a melodic component to it. If there is a loop, it's almost like a meditative experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. That's all I have to say. All I have to say to that, Marco.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Something else that's in the same vein is Hell March from Command & Conquer Red Alert.
Again. Oh yeah, ludwig.
Oh. Huh.
You look baffled.
Is it looping?
There's ice coming up. There's a big. I can see the sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's to happen. Oh, this is a repeat.
Yeah. The synth wave is in here now.
I'm just going to talk about the kind of the metal first part, because to me, I hear that there could be some pretty great hardcore vocals over that, and that it's no different than anything else. I mean, so my point is, since we're also talking about music out of the context maybe for which it was created, I don't see why this is video game music necessarily. There are Star Wars games, for example, that exist that use the actual Star Wars soundtrack.
Right.
So is the Star Wars soundtrack, just being very basic about that, because I've seen many a Star Wars, is that
video game music?
Is that all of a sudden video game music? As far as the second part, it's totally fine also. I'm curious to know why it's there. It had something to do with the player, if this is in real time. Speaking as somebody who is ignorant of gaming as a thing, or ignorant of the way that works, where the composer really structures the music in a particular way, the game may interrupt that, or what the player does may interrupt some of that.
This is one of those tracks that, while I think it's really impressive, I think it does need the sort of parallel. For me, I think it requires a little bit of that context, because otherwise I was just kind of okay.
I saw you looking very concerned that maybe it wasn't what you intended to play or something like that, because there was that repetition. I hear this as accompanimental to some very hard rock vocals, in which case the repetition might make sense in a way, because the lyrics will change.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're playing this game, I would imagine it may not seem as repetitive as it is.
And that's just it. It's interesting how it morphs depending on where you, and this is anything, right? But it just morphs the way that we interpret it based on where we hear it and how we hear it.
Yeah, and I would go so far as to say is that can apply to a lot of music for film. Can you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Batman. E flat minor, that oscillating third. What you get under Hans Zimmer's layer is that eventually you get the sustained, and that's nowhere near bad mouthing anybody. But the purpose of that is to create that underlying
the tension and the emotional
the tension underneath, but it doesn't distract from what is happening on the screen.
Right.
And that's Batman's theme, as for the Christopher Nolan film.
Something that's really cool is in a game called Portal 2, there's a track called Cara mia addio.
Cara mia! Hi, Marchissimo! Okay, so
as you can imagine, it's a aria. Guess it's a guess what that character is.
What that character is?
Yeah, it's an AI. That's GLaDOS. It's controlled. She tortures the main character pretty much, making her do a bunch of tests, and then the main character escapes and she sings farewell because now she's alone. He says, "Cara mia addio."
That's what I love about AI. Okay, no, wait. So I was supposed to guess that.
What I find interesting about that is the vocal quality it's muffled and it has this robotic element to it.
That's actually, I was going to say, now starting from the very beginning, even before the vocals, there was something that I felt in that introduction that was very different than anything else that we've heard before, because the tempo fluctuates. I mean, there are these pushes and pulls. That's live. Yes, it's synthesized. It's synthetic. The sounds are synthetic, but it feels like it's played in live. There are these pushes and pulls, these little stretches here and there. I found that very interesting because I had no idea where it was going as part of that. When the aria starts, all of those other sounds were meant to imitate other voices.
Yeah.
And I think that happened during the intro. I don't quite remember. I'm assuming that has something to do with the game or the narrative of the game. But I found that particularly interesting. I was wondering if all of those might have been samples of Ellen's voice that were, altered and whatnot, which would be very interesting from a compositional, from a constructive, the way the piece was constructive, from that standpoint, that's kind of an interesting tool to use. One of the things that you could do, the nature of this, with this is obviously it's a sci-fi game, is that it makes sense to alter the live sound to some degree, or to place those effects that you described to make her sound, like a robot or an AI entity.
Well, I also find it funny that like they chose to have this final goodbye be a proper Italian aria, which is really funny because it reminds me of like, the 25 Italian art songs or something, really like kind of basic in its structure, but it's so like real,
I was playing Caro mio ben.
Yeah, Caro mio ben. Caro mio ben.
I don't know how many gamers go out there and study voice and listen to the 24 greatest hits of all time, the 24 Italian art songs. Even if you haven't studied opera, is that you may have seen shows or parts of films or Bugs Bunny cartoons that reference it, right, where there are these particular styles of arias that are meant to evoke a particular type of emotion.
Yeah.
And so there's a familiarity there, and it is classically conceived. It's actually it's really quite lovely.
This might be the only exposure that someone gets to a proper Italian art song or aria, and they might take away from that and feel like a deep sense of emotion, because it's like, oh, well, this is a real thing that exists. It might even prompt someone to consider going to an opera.
You see, well, that is the thing, that I think is wonderful about what you are doing here. Many, I'm not saying all, and I'm not stereotyping composers who specialize in video game music. Many of them are self-taught. Many of them also have studied classically, or studied however they studied. I mean, I don't even know what classical means anymore. This little prompt, the idea of prompting somebody to go and listen to Nessun Dorma.
You're right.
Maybe even without any sort of visual whatsoever, with your eyes closed, listen to these beautiful 3 to 4 minute arias by Puccini or whoever, with Jussi Björling in full orchestra. It is this other world, and it can be just as emotional, particularly with that dynamic arc, which is something I was going to say about this piece also, because there are truly these wonderful textural changes we haven't heard yet in this show.
Yeah.
I mean, including the one solo moment, the one single note sustained before the aria starts, but then also the dynamics that are present in the aria itself. And it's not necessarily about loudness, because there's still an element of compression in the sound, and there's still the limited dynamics that I don't know if they're necessary for the production or whatnot. But the thing is that there is this changing intensity that happens to create this very melancholy, emotional thing from some sort of synthetic creature. This was the most interesting thing so far.
This particular piece, I've basically played it for everybody. It's just one of those pieces that I think it's just profound. It's probably one of the greatest pieces of video game music ever written. It's called Ludwig the Accursed and Holy Blade. like that one?
Yes. The pacing is very classical construction. Things come in threes, and the third time has some changing element. Like there's a place about 2.5 minutes, the basses and tenors are singing with strings underneath, and the third time the sopranos and altos, the female voices are added, and then that brings them somewhere else. And then there's another thing that basically 3 large events, and then move on. But one of the things is that I could predict where every like big cadence and big like a cymbal crash, or where there would be this big. And so it's, in a way that's very easy to follow for such a relatively complex harmonic language, more than we've heard thus far. It does what I'm assuming it's supposed to do with a name like Bloodborne. I'm assuming this is a narrative game.
Yes, highly so. But then every boss has a theme. So the bosses in games are like they're not the average Joe. This is like your really tough combatant. And in the case of Ludwig was supposed to be the savior of the place called Yharnam. And so when you find him, he's this decomposed man mixed with horse, and he has a giant sword called the Mulet Greatsword, and he's incredibly difficult, and there's blood everywhere, and it's a visceral fight, and it's actually terrifying, because here you are looking at the face of what was supposed to be a savior, and instead he's succumbed to this like bloodlust and become this deformity.
The thing that's really interesting then, depending how the gameplay works, similar to the Cara Addio that we listened to earlier, is that this has a similar build, completely different style. In fact, this started out with solo cello and strings. It's the addition. It's not so much layering, because nothing's really repetitive. Well, at the beginning, nothing's being repeated, and so there's this nice evolution. And so now this is where I want to get into dynamics. It's not just about loud and soft; it's about volume, which has to do also with texture and density. The addition of these instruments creates this building texture, and the fact that the music, very, very slowly increases in density, and it's this natural dynamic that exists that's not just about loudness and softness. And so that creates this intensity that dynamics are supposed to create. And it happens throughout, because all of these lines are weaving together. The presence of the solo cello in this is really kind of cool, because it occurs throughout. And just to prove that dynamics are not about loudness or softness, is that typically, an orchestra can just devour a cello, because a cello is in a range where everything, but the cello cuts through because of the nature of its, soloness. If this were a live performance, the cellist would have to be in front of the orchestra. Well, if it were live, and if it were really about video game music or film music, probably there would be mics everywhere. So, that can help things a little bit. But the single line cello does cut through so much in this. As far as the voices are concerned, I actually kind of wonder about this. You might know about this. And there's a part of me that felt, this is a live choir. But then there are also virtual choirs, because of just the nature of the vowel sounds and the fact that words stopped being said. And for some reason, the only word I could make out, when the chorus first ended, was the word dominum. And then the rest, so I was thinking, okay, so we're going to use the Latin something or other. That's not a criticism of the composition at all. The thing is that whatever medium you work with, whether it's synthetic or whether it's live, you got to make use of what you have. But the composers of this, really, I think, use this material use the forces, synthetic or otherwise, very, very effectively. At the 4-minute mark, there's a cappella vocals.
Yeah.
And then the addition of this, faintly underneath the strings, and then the strings get full, and then brass, and then timpani and cymbal crashes. And,
that's the part.
The underlying percussion. That was done very effectively, and that's another example of dynamics, not necessarily about loudness and softness. So, Marco, how do you like those tenor parts?
They're not aggressive, but they're pretty high.
They just sit up there. It's worse than Misa Solemnis. They just sit there in that tessitura that's like
Sopranos too. Oh my God, when it starts.
Yeah. But no, I think that the notion is, and if there is something that I am going to criticize about the writing, if this were live, which maybe it is or not, but the thing is, even in the studio with live people, you can fake some things. Keeping the voices up there or in the most intense range for a long period of time, to me, that means that some intensity is lost. because the intended intensity is persistent.
Oh, it deflates.
Anything that is just static.
Yeah.
Keeps going in that one line without growth or change. Like I was talking about dynamics earlier. In my mind, even if it's really loud and high and, higher, faster, louder or whatever, after a while, that becomes the norm. And then where do you go? That said, there was a really nice shape overall to this, but so much of the time when the voices were present, they were just screaming.
Punching, yeah. Sometimes you have a really good singer, and they after a while, you're like, okay.
With what we were talking about earlier regarding an aria, that's a good reason to go back and actually listen to some solo classical vocal music, whether it's one of the Italian greatest hits, or whether it's, I'm going back to Nessun Dorma or O mio bambino caro. I keep mentioning Puccini. I'm a kind of a Puccini kick at the moment. Well, because not only could that guy write for voice, he was a great orchestral composer. I did enjoy this very much. I mean, I was impressed.
I'm glad you liked that one. That one was one I was excited to share with you. In the same vein, but very different, there's this awesome piece from Warframe. God, I don't even know that I actually heard this piece when I played the game, but this is called the Fragmented one. To me, it really it sort of leans into this experimental thing, and certainly there's an otherworldly quality to that, especially with the. It's interesting because the more that we get into the vocals of the whisper and something that sounds really human, the more otherworldly it sounds, especially with the whispering, which I find really interesting.
Is that what you mean by experimental? Or
yeah, in that particular case, it feels like not non-standard, but it certainly. I think it really deviates from stereotypical soundscape that we would hear in a video game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that's actually something that it's funny you say that, because that's actually something that crossed my mind. I was actually really surprised at the direction this went after the opening, that it became this trendy thing, just because I didn't know obviously what to expect. About 145, 150 is when it changes and you start hearing the hey, but it's just, that's all it is, because it goes down to this single note, which we haven't heard much of. The color of the instruments being voice, and the voice is chanting and whispering and is rhythmic. Kind of the cool layering and the fact that some of them sustain, it alternates between, some sort of rhythmic vocal counterpoint with call and response. And so there is this constant change of texture that happens during the course of this. That is particularly interesting. Now, I'm kind of wondering what's going on in the game, because with the exception of the aria, which was a closing something or other, closing part of something, it could be the epilogue to the, so maybe the game is over, but you sit there and watch it.
That's exactly actually when that is, yeah.
This
wow.
So, I mean, the thing is, video games and film are becoming, because video games are becoming interactive films.
For sure they are.
But if video games are sort of like interactive films, grain of salt, big picture kind of statement. But if that is the case, the role of music has changed from vampire killers, where it's this repeated thing, or, I mean, Pac-Man or Space Invaders, where the music was,
Mm-hmm.
And eventually get faster. Okay, there you go. There's a nice moment to keep on. So I wonder what's going on, because the thing is, all that's instrumental. Now you add these things, you add these words there. You're playing again. I'm assuming sometimes you have to repeat levels, therefore you repeat the entire experience, which means you repeat the music. After a while, the addition of these vocals, and you're saying, well, what the fuck are they saying? Soon you can kind of tune that out in a way. We focus on whatever the action is. I always find it sad when you have to tune music out a little bit, because I don't think that there's any composer who wants their music to be relegated to the background. And I really shouldn't say that, because I now just thought of 3 who actually wrote music specifically, with that intention. So I take that back. But the fact that the whole purpose of this program is to bring this music out so that it's not ignored. Like I said, I'm not a gamer, but some of these more complex pieces, I go, wow, what are the players doing right now?
Yeah. Usually fighting for their life, to be honest with you. And in this particular moment, this is a fight against the fragmented one. It's so interesting because the music really, in this particular instance, raises the stakes. And so when you get that chant, it's almost like it taps into the humanity of, despite the virtual medium, right? You're like literally thrust into a life or death situation. And that music actually, it's funny. I played a game similar to Bloodborne called Dark Souls 3. And one of the really hard fights near the end, I played it with the music off, and I was on the phone, and I beat it in the first try because there was no sense of stress. And the stress, yes, comes maybe from the difficulty of the boss, but it really comes from the elevated experience emotionally of playing the game with the music on. So when you take the music away, it saps the life out of the thing, where it's like, ooh, that's a fun fight. But if you remove the music, then you have just the mechanics of the game.
Right.
Which is fine. And that's why people play games, because of the mechanics of the gameplay or the visuals or whatever. But if we add the music, then suddenly we're thrust at a level that's way higher. One of the things that's difficult about listening to music in a vacuum is these questions of like, well, what is happening? Because so much of this goes hand in hand with the sequence. There's a game, I want to play you a song here in a second from Ace Combat. And in Ace Combat, there's a prog rock emphasis, but it loops quite a bit. And what I found while playing through this 3 of them in a row is that these tracks actually, because if you're in a fighter plane and you're shooting enemies, you actually need no distraction. And the music being elevated allows you to like spin in a repetitive state. You end up in a mindfulness state of like concentration. So the thing is, like, the repetition out of context is not exactly appealing, and some of these tracks out of context could be boring. And I'm not saying that you said that, but what I mean to say is that like it saps it a little bit, because if we were watching it, it would be different. And to your other point, there is a moment in the song I'm about to play for you, Daredevil from Ace Combat 7, there is a moment where something happens that thrusts the main thrust, well, thrusting and talking about a playing game, but that's the moment that the vocals come in. But in the soundtrack version, which we'll listen to, that moment is connected so that you don't have the big drop. So there's the sequence essentially is you're flying in a plane. You need to break down the barrier of this big giant bird called the Arsenal bird. What's really cool about this track is that the rumor is supposedly they literally delayed this game for X amount of time because they had to nail this particular soundtrack. And this motif actually exists throughout the entire game.
That's tension and release, my friend.
Yes,
tension
it's so good. I mean,
because you can't have one without the other, but the more tension you have, the greater the release. Grass.
Yeah.
There's some cool lines underneath. High sopranos again.
Yeah.
But they waited. Used it.
For the sake of context, really quick, let me just send you the perfect moment. I just want you to get the full picture of it before we launch into the discussion, because it's one of my favorite pieces.
I swear that my asking this question is not making fun of you. Did you just say this is one of your favorite pieces?
Yes.
Like of anything?
Yeah.
Or just video game music? Or
of anything. I listen to this nearly every day.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Ace Combat.
I honestly don't, because that's a big thing to say.
On cuckoo count? Away with you. Look. Just what kind of magic did you work there, you asshole? It wasn't magic. It's a scam. Now's our chance. Do it, Trigger.
You see how in the recording it's all smashed together, but in that there's a moment of pause, a caesura,
yes,
where we have that silence before the magic moment. It's so satisfying.
It's actually really quite effective, because the use of silence can be something very powerful. This was particularly well paced, and I started writing timings down when I felt like I should. The underlying background is that those running 16th note patterns, or maybe 8th notes, or whatever the tempo is supposed to be. The addition of attacks on top of that's sustained. What is particularly interesting is that despite that repetition underneath, which is mostly an ostinato, I don't remember it all to say that it's really strictly just this repeated. That's really strictly repeated, but it's constant. That helps the energy. The only reason why that helps drive the energy is because of the way things change on top of it. You have the first section that has that, and then, the sustained chords. But then, like a minute and 10 seconds into it, those sustained chords are now transformed into these staccato hits. It's exciting because that is actually sort of, I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. It's a development of those sustained things, but instead of the sustained, you have the action, because you sustain something and it's nice and smooth and it's steady. But if you have something that's staccato, bam, it just punches you. About a minute and 10, minute and 15 in there, this got really exciting for me. A minute and 44 in is when the solo vocal, the vocalist enters with her ha. And, that kind of thing. Sorry, I'm not really a singer. She sings those long bells. And so that's the first time we hear sort of sustain on its own, even though that little thing continues, but it's quiet. A very effective use of dynamics in that sense as well, which is about that. In that sense, it is about softness and loudness. The build at around 2:15, with the high strings, and then that builds into what is actually at 2:50. It is a repetition of 1:10 in terms of the musical content, but the orchestration is huge. Is that a very effective use of these instruments? Virtual or otherwise. I think this whole thing is virtual orchestra, but which doesn't matter. Really, really well done and well used and well executed, because it's also this big dynamic shift. It's and then there are more voices, but then there's the high soprano again. Now, that's a good use of some really high voices, because you'll wait to use them.
Yeah.
Use them all the time. So there is an excitement that builds in this over a period of time. This might be something good for students to study. It might be something, if I were doing a unit, if I were not retired, a unit on video game music or something, on constructing such things, because that's what you imitate. You imitate structures to create, to help you create and then find new sounds, perhaps. That's one way to look at it. Is that this is a good thing to study for that. 3:18, the full voice with orchestra, drops down at 4:06 and builds to the end. And it's a very effective piece of music. This is also, by the way, a good study of what a composer could do with very, very few materials. Because it's not like, as powerful as you might think this piece of music is. Because, you listen to it every day. I'm not sure that the reason is because there are 1,000 ideas. I think the reason is because there are a few ideas, few little things, and the composer produces this whole structure with the very economical use of those materials, and spreading things out so that these nice structural events that happen, and then you can anticipate them. And in this version, which we could call maybe an absolute version or a concert version, as opposed to what happens with the action. So there are some really cool things that happen.
If I could play you this entire soundtrack, I would, because there's just so many things. And what I really love about Kiki Kobayashi is there's also a modern oratorio approach in a lot of the big finale moments in this, where we literally, fuck it, I'm going to play you one because whatever. And then I got to cut some of these other songs I wanted to play for you because we're getting in the woods, and I can't upload a 3-hour video, so I can't do that. But
not with that attitude, you can't.
There's so much music I would love to share with you, but I can't let you not listen to what I'm talking about right now.
Nice little effect in the right side.
It's the rocket and the jet.
Wait, the rocket? Yeah, I was just saying. It's the... Just really subtle cymbal sound.
Yeah.
Like on the offbeat.
Yeah.
When you say modern oratorio, are you just saying modern piece with choir and orchestra, or something? I just want to be clear what you mean by that.
What I mean is that there's a Latin text. The structure of it feels like you could program it in a symphonic in symphony, and this could be obviously it's not the Bach St. Matthew Passion.
You can't even really compare them.
No, but in terms of the liturgical text being used, this stuff that you would also hear in an oratorio, you know what I mean? So the Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, grant us peace,
Is there something relevant to that particular text with the game?
Well, basically every time you play it, you are basically an unstoppable force, and the planes themselves are basically like gods fighting each other. And so this particular track comes when you're facing against this guy, Mihai, who's one of the best fighter pilots to ever exist. So there's a deification of him, but then you're also the only pilot that can actually also take him on. So in essence, you become like Jesus Christ of the skies. You're constantly saving the world from nuclear destruction. It transcends just the silly little plane game element of oh, look, I'm a fighter pilot. And it becomes I am the savior of the planet, of the world. And it's the only game I've played that really uses liturgical text like this to really evoke the sense of deification, if that makes sense.
And this is not a put down of anybody. I'm just saying is that I can think of a few pieces like this, or a few excerpts of pieces that are very much like this by several other composers. I mean, you can go back to like Carmina Burana, and
oh yeah, of course.
Something very different from that is Phantom Menace, which I loathe to bring up, except that it does have a very good score by John Williams.
Yeah,
where he makes use of very similar forces. He's got, of course, the London Phil, and there are some similar kind of builds and textural, evocations. And I don't even know if his was particularly, the first time anybody thought of that, but it was very effective.
Yeah,
Where it occurred. It's not a question of necessarily the quality, because this is good stuff. It's very well constructed.
It actually leads me to a question for you, because from a compositional perspective, so obviously this music's being written with some sort of intention in mind, right? And now when you sit down to compose a piece, are you like thinking, and I've talked to composers of video games, and I have some friends that, have done a bunch of stuff in the composition in the video game music world. With them, they have to approach it from emotion first, and like an idea of the emotional like integrity, right? But so if we're writing absolute music or pieces that are existing like on stage, are you as a composer, are you writing from an emotional state first, or are you like, what is the impetus? Like as a composer, what are you drawn to for inspiration, or for like the impetus to write?
That's a very big question, because that also requires a little bit of context in a way, because it sort of depends on what it is that I'm trying to do, what it is that I'm working on, why I'm writing the piece and whatnot. Because I mean, most of my work is commissioned, so I have specific things and specific forces, but also specific occasions or specific reasons to write a piece. It's a very difficult thing to answer in some ways. I'm not saying that I'm done studying music, because I'm studying it right now with you. So I mean, I always have things to learn and things to do, and I embrace it. That's what's so great about having such a huge palette. I've written pieces that are actually more inspired by extra musical things, which could be emotion, but could be a particular event. It could be a particular painting or a picture or somebody dancing, or it could be that I'm collaborating with a video artist. And so, my music has to be relevant to all of those things if I'm collaborating. If I'm writing something that's absolute, it's got to be, one, I'm not going to try and write something I don't hear. I think that's silly. So I have to be able to hear what I'm writing. So therefore, what I'm composing has to be something from within. I'm not going to pretend that the muse comes down and speaks to me in French, and that I'm going to writhe around the floor in some sort of existential angst, waiting for the spirit of God to come in me, and then all of a sudden I write, oh, there it is. It's not really like that, because I mean, the thing is, I also have pushing 40 years of craft behind me that I've learned. I know how to do certain things instinctively, and I know how to make use of either a C major triad or a tone cluster, or I know how to use certain kinds of rhythms. So, like, I'm not really worried about musical language. I'm not really I love so many different kinds of music. Anyway, that seems like it's going away from your question, but my point is that is the impetus. Rite of Spring, right? The famous chord. Did you know that chord was what he called the tolchak? The tolchak meaning the impetus, the pulse. Not pulse as the fact that it pulses, but it's the pulse of the piece.
Yeah.
And the entire, he just sat down and decided to play an E flat 7 chord and an E major chord at the same time. It's just his hands naturally felt in those two tonal positions. Maybe they were both going to be E flat, or maybe they were both going to be E, but he moved one up or down a half step, depending on how you look at it. And that became the impulse for something. And for him, he did know that the ballet was going to be about some sort of virgin sacrifice ritual. He knew that that's what it was going to be about. So particularly, I would imagine that is not really appropriate. Taking aside rhythm and taking aside everything else, that's the harmonic impetus for most of the pieces. And, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is as good as any rock and roll I've ever heard. I should say it's actually one of my Desert Island pieces. But see, with him, it was a chord for that piece. With me, it depends on the context. Then, like for him, it was other things. It depends on the context of what I'm writing and why I'm writing it. And, I've done some things for money where I just did what I've told, and I think I did a pretty good job. But there are some things that I've done that are strictly for me that really come from an emotional place. I have 55 seconds of music, of effects music, in Sharknado 5. But I mean, the impetus for that is that I actually literally had, it was the last day of classes, actually, and I skipped that day of classes. When that came out, I had 4 hours to do this, and I mean, I got it, I got it done. I'd never done that particular genre with, a particular thing that I've never seen before or heard before, and it was about sharks killing Chris Kattan as the English Prime Minister. And so the impetus there is that sometimes you just got to get it done, or sometimes you have a deadline.
Right.
But at least it was aleatoric, and there were some things I didn't have to worry so much about a particular language, but I did, my pride said, well, I've got to make sure things are consistent, and things were, and as well, it works well. I think that was composed before the film was even edited. It's cool, so I get this little credit for effects music in that. But I'm just saying is that the impetus was something different. Now, when you're working in a commercial field, whether it's film or video games, you have to work in a particular time frame, but you can't write. Well, I'm not going to say you can't, but I mean, depending on the fact, looking at some of these games that are sort of episodic, is that your pieces can't be 4-hour oratorios.
No, they can't. It can't.
In segments, and so there is this impetus there also, where craft helps you. Like, you have these ideas that may be emotional, but the craft also helps you to develop. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the craft, when it works really well, it takes over the emotion from the impetus, and it contributes to whatever it is in music that creates an emotional response.
This is like something that I think is so experimental, to the point that I don't even think that a piece like this could exist on the radio, because it would drive people insane. And I mean that in like the best way possible. This is Guilty Gear Strive. This theme, Symphony, ABA's theme,
empathy, kindness, serenity, clarity. Break out, turn the key to a world untold. Life fades the maze where the wind burns. Blah, 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 blah. Sick and tired, normal, no big deal. I'm just quality note in the symphony. Oh, the voice is mine.
shift is crazy. This is a wall reference, Pink Floyd.
This drummer's the cymbal sound is really good. Piano in the background. Yeah, no, that was very cool.
Yeah.
That was very cool. There are those moments that happened. One of the things I got pretty excited about the fact that it went back into the Black Flag, the constant drum thing. But like in the background, you hear the lyric piano.
Yeah.
And it's still present. That's the wonderful thing about being able to do things in the studio, is that there's this gentle piano, and because I cheated and I looked at some of the lyrics and whatnot. Break out, and also we're just quirky no stupidity. I'm not here to fit in this world. I just want to make a difference, and the whole time, but in the back, and it's this thing that's happening in the back. See, to me, like those details make this interesting. And I mean, obviously that's also a reference to the constant shift, all the changes that happen during the course of it. But you got a little, I brought up Saga earlier. I for some reason.
Yeah.
But you got a little Queen, you got a little ABBA, you got a little Black Flag, and maybe just like a pinch of Styx is in there, and it's like all these, all these different sort of things are in there. In the case of like Queen and Styx in particular, there were elements of classical music influence, and with both of those. So that like you have all this meta influence. It's really good. Is the whole game like that?
So the game is like 2D fighter, like think like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat from the 90s, right. But like it's just like it's really colorful. The characters are super wacky and weird. This is actually, so these are all character themes technically. Mm-hmm. So this represents the character ABA. There's a lot more. Maybe
I'm gonna look this, because there's something about this that I need to actually. Well, some things you have to hear more than once. Even a piece you don't like. I'm not intimating that I don't like this. I'm pretty psyched about this. But if I hear a piece I don't like and I don't really know why it just doesn't sit well, I have to listen to it again, and maybe 2 more times, so I understand why I don't like it. Now, maybe part of that's because of what I do for a living. But the other thing is that I'm very curious to know why. I'm going to say something about this one that I didn't say about any of the other ones. I find this one thoroughly entertaining. That's not a belittling term, and it's not.
No. I know exactly what you mean.
But this is thoroughly entertaining. I'm probably going to share this with my daughter.
I'm going to give you an option here, because now I'm starting to think I could play you another song from Guilty Gear Strive, which is, there's a lot of good ones. I could play you a jazz piece, or I could play you a Prince cover piece that exists in a video game.
I'm going to say either the jazz or the Prince, because this one is too fresh. If I do something that's contrasting, let's go with jazz, because I think I may have heard the Prince one. I did some research before coming on here today.
Okay.
So I think I know the one you're talking about, but I have to say that it's a really cool piece, and my buddy Garth liked it too. So
yes. Okay, the Rain, formerly known as Purple, was the one. Yes. Yeah, we'll do this. This is Battle from Torna of the Golden Country from Xenoblade Chronicles 2.
Got the 70s Love Boat strings.
Yeah.
It does.
I know.
Cool bass. Nice shifting beats of the drum.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Urhu?
Yeah.
Very
violin. Yeah, I think it's the Argo, yeah. I love the pullback there.
What's that?
The pullback is so cool.
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was going to loop. It doesn't.
This bass player is badass.
Yeah, right. It is Urhu, yeah.
Like out of nowhere, Urhu.
And it's double with the violin after, yeah. Cool.
Her name was Lola. Lola. She was a showgirl. I wanted to hear an ending, but it fades.
I know it's a loop. It's a loop.
Now, since it is a loop, I mean, I'm just wondering. I mean, there are those improvised bits, and what's interesting is that this is the first piece that we've heard that had an element of improvisation. It's like a cool, energetic version of Copacabana. I mean that in a good way because I actually think that's a really good song. I don't care what anybody says. It's an amazing song. It's a great arrangement. What an incredible mix between sort of 1970s television theme music, Fantasy Island. Love Boat, things like that with those high strings soaring above, rhythm that's going on underneath. And I keep waiting for Paul Williams to start singing or somebody like that, or whoever sang for Mike Post. And then you have this trio, this post-bop jazz trio, inserting these wonderful, these chords outside of and all that. And then I'm looking at the YouTube screen and I'm wondering, where's the boat? Where's the island? Oh, there's a big fucking dragon in the sky or something.
Yeah.
And this guy with a sword. And I'm thinking, wow, now I have to actually figure out what this game is if that is the soundtrack. I just wonder how those worlds collide. I don't know necessarily what makes what I listen to video game music, except for the fact that it's obviously part of some video game.
In a video game.
I don't know. It sounds like post-Chuck Mangione in a way, in a very good way. What fun that is. That's all I got to say about it. I mean, sometimes it's okay just to enjoy something, but I mean, cool stuff. And I agree with you. I like that pullback.
We've gone through a lot. We did a lot of discussing about repetition and some theory and sort of the evolution. And there's just so much, Greg. There's just so much there were like 8 tracks that I had to cut from this.
Because I talk too much.
No, that's not why. But there's just also just a sheer 40 years of content. And I think it's interesting to see where we were, and it's interesting to see where we've landed. And my question to you is, how has this changed, if any, your perception of? I doubt you had any sort of preconceptions, but has anything changed for you about what video games are, what video game music is?
Well, we never really talked about video games, so I don't know that anything's changed about what I think video games are. I just simply, for no particular reason, it's not a disdain or it's not anything else. Well, actually, there is a good reason, is time requirements. I don't necessarily have the time to spend on epic games because I could probably, I would imagine that I can become very addicted to them. I'm in a situation in a profession where I don't really have time. As far as the music, I don't know. I didn't really have any preconceived notions because I've always felt that music can stand on its own. I don't need a visual component or action of any kind necessarily to appreciate a good piece of music or a piece of music, or to understand a piece of music, whether it's good or not necessarily good, which doesn't mean it's to my liking or not to my liking, because I like so much stuff.
I agree with you.
You agree with me that I like lots of stuff?
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, look at that bookshelf. Look at that shelf of albums by CDs.
Well, that's only one wall. Like over here, let's see. I've got. Oh look. Here's one of my CDs.
Light and Shadows, Waves in Time.
Yes, but anyway, sorry, I had to do that. So I don't know that anything's necessarily changed, but what I do appreciate, Marco, and I think that what you're doing is really cool. I think it's important. I'm going to say from an educational standpoint, but also you're engaging people who are very passionate about this music or who want to learn some things about this music, and I I really am so appreciative that you brought me here today. You know, you taught me something. So I guess something has changed if you taught me something. I mean, it's basically you've exposed me to some literature I haven't heard before for no particular reason. It's just this isn't where I've been living. And you gave me, I mean, I wrote a bunch of things down so I can explore some music I haven't heard. But I am going to say this. If the music exists on its own, it's not necessarily video game music or film music. It's music. Is that there is... I don't necessarily subscribe to the tenet that music is a universal language, because there are so many different musics that we need to learn and understand. So it's not necessarily universal. However, the use of music, I mean, there's a universality to what music is and how you experience it. And in the most basic way is you sit down and you listen to it. And this is music whose function might be, or not might be, whose function is to accompany action in video games. However, it doesn't have to serve only that purpose. It can, it can serve the purpose to, just be something you listen to and enjoy, or listen to and analyze, or listen to and emote to, or whatnot, for whatever reason. And I think that applies to pretty much everything.
Yeah, something can grab you, and you can. It doesn't matter if it's Bach, Beethoven, any music can take you. And I think that's really the discussion. I think it's really some folks really do struggle with that, and I think like if I guess there's no problem with music just for its own sake, but also there's nothing wrong with needing context to feel the connection to a piece, or like to relate to characters, or to to take that music and relate it to your own life. Like, all of these things are viable and important. We just have to understand why we like pieces or why we don't like pieces, and what it makes us feel. I think that's a really important task. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you coming on and just like being able to like expose someone to something new is something that I always find great value in, and I appreciate. And it's the reason why I even went into opera, because someone was like, listen to this, and I was like, this shit sucks, and then I was like, oh, it's actually good. Like I'll never forget, like I used to hate Benjamin Britten, and then I sat down and listened to Peter Grimes, and I was like, oh my god, like this is
and there's some great orchestral music alone in that.
I know
the interludes and the Passacaglia.
If I can do one thing for somebody, it would just be to let them hear something. So, I mean, it's my pleasure. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And thanks a ton, everybody. We'll see you on the next one. I really appreciate it. See you, everybody.
Thank you much.